All right, now we can officially start. So just a disclaimer that this webinar will be recorded and we will put it online, but the only people that will be visible are us as hosts and future panelists, and so none of the attendees will be visible, so no worries there. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're excited to speak with you, and well, we're excited to speak to you and hear from you about your questions and talk more about the fellowship. So we can introduce ourselves. And Jacob?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jacob Lipton. I'm the co-executive director of Justice Catalyst, where, among other things, I run the fellowship program, and thrilled to be speaking with you all today.
And my name is Jasenia. I work with Jacob at Justice Catalyst. I'm a program associate and assist with the fellowship program. We will be joined later by Jonathan Miller. He is the legal director at Public Rights Project, which does a joint fellowship with Justice Catalyst, which we will speak more about. And we're also joined today by Maya. Maya, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hey, everybody. I'm super happy to be here with you tonight. My name is Maya Ragsdale. And like Yesenia mentioned, I was a Justice Catalyst Fellow, and then have continued to be supported in my new role as Executive Director of Beyond the Bars, which kind of came out of my fellowship with Justice Catalyst. So I'm excited to talk to you guys more about that.
Awesome, thank you. So we can go through the agenda real quick, but I also wanted to let everyone know that people can feel free to use the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen, or send things through the chat, and we will respond to them as we go along through the fellowship, and we will have a time at the end to go more thoroughly through questions and answers, of which you could see on this agenda. So first, we will introduce ourselves as an organization, who Justice Catalyst is. Then we will transition to talk about the fellowship a little bit more at length. Then we will talk about the application timeline and some tips that we have for everyone that is applying. And then we will have time to hear from Maya, who will speak about her experience. And we'll discuss a little bit about programming and what it's like to be a fellow. And then we will hear from John Miller, who will speak about the Justice Catalyst Public Rights Project Fellowship. And then we will, again, open it up for questions. So at first, if you've seen our website, it might help to have a little bit more clarity. I promise we're having a nice new website coming out soon, and you will see. But before we begin discussing the fellowship a little bit more, we should discuss how there are two different organizations here, and we'd like to distinguish the information you might have come across. So Justice Catalyst Law, on the right, is different than the partner organization that we are, which is Justice Catalyst. So Justice Catalyst Law is a nonprofit litigation shop that takes on social justice issues that fall between the cracks of traditional advocacy models by applying a cross-disciplinary approach to the law with the ultimate goal to protect consumers, workers, and marginalized groups. And I'll hand it over to Jacob to discuss Justice Catalyst.
So thanks, Yesenia. So Justice Catalyst is a separate entity from Justice Catalyst Law, but we work very closely together. And we have three main work streams at Justice Catalyst. So one is philanthropic advising. We connect funders and grants with organizations around the country, mostly nonprofits promoting legal innovation for social justice in a variety of ways. And a big part of that work is trying to foster projects and collaborations between different parts of what we see as a very siloized legal system, and support work that is going after powerful actors, and especially the entanglement of private and public injustices and those profiting from injustice. So that's one piece. A second we call Catalyst Impact, and that's similar. It's promoting legal innovation, and in that case, it's using other sources of funding to promote public interest litigation, including through non-recourse loans, where mostly nonprofits who are litigating can borrow money to bring cases and then only pay back if they win those cases and recover fees. So it's an additional way to support legal innovation. And we think that there's much more work that lawyers can do here and more creativity that can be engaged while we also have a strong awareness that the role and prominence of lawyers should be very different in different types of work, we think one of the barriers to that innovation is that new lawyers are rarely encouraged and trained to do this kind of work, and vitally, that there's not funding to do this kind of systemic work. So we're doing our best to fill those gaps as best we can. And one of the ways we fill those gaps is through the fellowship program, which is the third piece of the JC stool. So that's, I'm sure, why you're here today, to hear about the fellowship program. So we will turn to that now. So the first thing to know about the Justice Catalyst Fellowship is that it is project-centric. So what we're really paying attention to when we're selecting applications and when we're thinking about what would make a good fellowship project is the project itself, and that's what we look at first. We're, of course, interested in the host organization and the fellow's ability to carry out that project. There's no point in having a good project unless you can do it, but the project is very much primary. Most of our projects are problem-centric. So the general approach we recommend is that you identify a problem in the world and then a potential approach to addressing or mitigating that problem. Solving is probably too strong for any real problem in the course of a fellowship year. We are especially excited about supporting projects that are radical, that aim at broad-scale change, that are systemic in some way, and that are sustainable in some way. And let me say a little bit more about what each of those mean. So I think radical speaks for itself. We think that many other funders are not interested in supporting radical work, certainly in this space, and so we want to be there to support radical projects that are really aiming to make major change. And that major change is a big thing for us. So we really care about projects that aim at broad-scale change. And I'll come back to this several times because it's a big thing for us. We recommend that in your application, you tell us about how your project is aiming at broad-scale change. There's a lot of different ways of doing that I'll come to, but we really want to hear how your project will affect people's lives at a wide level. Systemic is really another way of saying some of those same things. And sustainable, a project can be sustainable in a lot of different ways, but we're paying attention to, is there a plan for this project to have effects beyond the fellowship term, or to be continued in some way beyond the fellowship term, or maybe to create a model that can be self-sufficient beyond the fellowship term. That can also look like a lot of different things, but we're interested in sustainability beyond the fellowship. We are also excited about supporting projects that are in development or perspective, because we also think those are the kind of projects that are often hardest to find funding for. I'll discuss a bit later how our application structure is set to promote those. But if you have a germ of an idea or are beginning to think through an idea but haven't got it all figured out, you've come to the right place. We want to help you develop that into a full-blown project. We do not have any subject matter restrictions at all on our fellowship. So we often get questions about this, about all kinds of different things. The answer is always no. There are no subject matter restrictions. Our focus is primarily domestic United States. So we have had some projects that have an international focus, especially if they have some kind of nexus to the US. So it's not a strict rule. The most common example of those are some immigration-focused projects that have been based in Mexico, but we've also had some projects focused on corporate accountability internationally that haven't necessarily been based in the US. But primarily our focus is domestic. We are paying attention when in reviewing projects to the theory of change. To say a bit more about what I mean, let's turn to that now. So we think with projects that are aiming to be radical, that are aiming at broad-scale change, there are many, many different ways of achieving that. And so what we really want to hear from you is how your approach in your fellowship project addresses the problem you've identified. Again, those can be very widespread, but here are some that we've seen, not a complete list by any means. So many projects are focused on affirmative litigation. That might be impact litigation of various types, or mainstreaming an affirmative practice in an institution that is primarily doing defensive work, legal aid organization especially, or public defenders. So we have many affirmative litigation projects of all different types of litigation. One theory of change can be targeting powerful actors that can make it more difficult for them and raise the cost, sometimes literally, of them doing injustice. And so we have many projects that are built around targeting powerful actors in one way or another. Many of our projects use movement lawyering approaches to help empower community groups and organizations to make change, so that the lawyer is subsidiary to that. And so that's a theory of change we often see and like. Some of our projects are might be described as coalition work or gap filling or infrastructure building, with infrastructure used broadly there. Sometimes you can have the greatest effect in a fellowship project when there's an existing coalition that's already working on a topic, or maybe a latent coalition that needs coordination or activation. And sometimes that that can mean building infrastructure that's mobilizing other actors or other lawyers. An example you might think of for that is the Innovation Law Lab, where we've had a couple different fellows, which builds model briefings and a case management infrastructure and lots of other things that allow many other lawyers to then do work. And that's a way they can maximize their effect outwards. Another theory of change we've seen in fellowships is piloting a new strategy. So maybe the goal is that you will go into an organization for a year or two and carry out a project. And if it's successful, it can be then adopted maybe by more widely at that organization, or can be adopted by other organizations. So we think that's a theory of change, kind of a narrowly tailored project that is aiming to be a pilot for a strategy that goes elsewhere. So those are some of the theories of change you might think about for a fellowship project. Let me talk about the kind of hosts we're looking for. So again, the big answer here is that varied. We have a wide range of different types of host organizations. And the biggest question you should ask is, what's the best host organization for the project I want to do? But I can say a little bit more than that. So what best fit for your project means, it might be that they bring expertise that you need to do this project. It might mean that they have resources that they bring to bear, which could be financial or could be their connections or their network. Maybe they're part of a coalition and they play the right place in the coalition to be doing the kind of work you want to do. And they certainly must have commitment to the project and share your commitment to carrying out this project. We're open to non-traditional host organizations, and let me say a bit more about what I mean by that. So most of our projects are at 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Those are by far the easiest projects for us to support, because it's easy to get funding to a 501c3. But there are plenty of projects that are not at those C3 organizations. So that includes the Joint Fellowship with Public Rights Project that you'll hear more about in a little bit, which is focused on state, local, and tribal government projects. We've also had projects at unions, public defenders, plaintiffs' firms, all of which may not be nonprofit organizations, but we have support projects there when they're very public interest focused, the project specifically and the organization. We also are very happy to support projects that at organizations that aren't necessarily the same ones that are always applying to host fellows, law school graduate fellows. So we have plenty of fellows at those large organizations that everyone knows, but also we're happy to support a fellowship at a small, scrappy organization that may not even have a lawyer on staff. You could be the first lawyer on their staff. One thing to bear in mind there is that that's very project dependent. So there's some kind of projects where it's really fine for you to be the only lawyer on staff, or maybe you can get some mentorship from the lawyers who are not employed by that organization but are working with them in some way. On the other hand, if you're trying to bring a case to the Supreme Court, you're probably going to want to be working at an organization where you're not the only lawyer there, to the extent that's a good idea for your project anyway. So I think broadly about what kind of host organization makes the best sense for you, but know that usually the easiest answer for us is if it's the easiest answer for us is if it's a 501c3. We are attentive to having a diversity of host organizations, as we are attentive to diversity in all its manifestations in the fellowship program. And when it comes to host organizations, that means geographic diversity, as well as practice type diversity, issue area diversity, as well as who's at the organizations, and we're paying attention to all of those things. One way to get a sense of the type of projects that might be a good fit for us is to look through some of our past projects. You can find those all on justicecatalyst.org/fellows or justicecatalyst.org/news to find some press releases listing past fellowship projects. But we are really excited about novel ideas and projects that we haven't encountered before. So don't at all feel like if you have a project in mind, I have to go and find something on the website that looks something like that. The fact that we haven't supported something in an issue area or an approach before doesn't mean we wouldn't in the future. We're still only a few years into this, and so still new ideas are coming up every year. But still, it may be helpful to look through some of our past projects. Now I'm going to turn over to Jasenia to talk a little bit about the timeline.
Sure. So our timeline is structured to foster the kind of projects that we're looking for. And that's why we have the prospectus within our two-stage application. And Jacob, at the end of this, will talk a little bit more about the prospectus. But at first, the first stage, we have the resume and prospectus. That, as you all hopefully may or may not know, is open now and rolling up until October 13th, so in about 2 weeks. This is optional, but it's highly recommended. Then we have the full application, which is rolling until December 1st, and you can submit at any time. That is required. Then we have rolling interviews, which are selective. If you're selected, we reach out to you, and it is remote. And final decisions are made around February 15th, and that as well is rolling. And renewal happens for some of our fellows, and that is to be determined based on the project. And you also have to submit an application for that.
And I'll say a bit more about what that looks like. So I'll now go briefly through each of these stages that Jasenia has just described to give you a sense of what's included in them. So, actually, before Jasenia, you're going to say something about the website. Sorry.
Oh yeah, no problem. So I just wanted to let you know where it is on the website. So all this can be found on our website currently, and I have a sneak peek of our future website, which will be launched soon. On both websites, it will be found in the navigation bar. If you click fellowships, then you can get to this page. We will have the information sheets there, the timeline, and more information, as well as the links to the actual forms where you could fill out the application.
So the first stage is the prospectus, and the prospectus is optional, but highly recommended, and there's really no downside. So really recommend that you submit a prospectus, and it's the best way to get in touch with us and tell us a bit about the idea you have and get some response from us. So the goal is for you to be able to work with us to develop your proposal in some way. And I'll talk through what the elements are, but let me say a bit more about what that might look like. So we receive several hundred prospectuses each year, and it's not the case that we can give detailed, engaged feedback to every single one, but we can and do reply to every single one in some way or another. So the ways we might reply are to let you know that this project sounds great and encourage you to submit a full application. That may be it. Or we may say this project sounds great, but doesn't seem like an ideal fit for a Justice Catalyst Fellowship for one reason or another. And so we want to let you know that before you go to all the effort of filling out a full application. It's not a required step, so you're still always welcome to apply, and we'll reiterate that in whatever communication we have with you. But we want to give you that heads up so you can think about where to spend your limited time. Or maybe if there's a couple different pieces of the project you suggested, or you've suggested a couple different projects, we may let you know this is the piece that it sounds most exciting to us or most promising to us for a fellowship, so we might advise you focus on that. So given that the prospectus is optional, we think that means by some rule of logic that all the elements within it also have to be optional. But the elements you might think about including are a brief problem statement identifying the problem you're hoping to address, what your approach to addressing that problem will be, something about your theory of change, which is really about how your approach will address the problem, and included within that is scale, how many people will you be able to help or affect through this approach, directly and indirectly. If you have a sense of why you think that there's not much funding for this type of approach, or conversely, what other models or analogs for this kind of approach are, you can mention that. If you have particularly strong skills or experience or connection to the problem, that's something you can mention. We also ask that you, and again, all this information is in the info sheet, you mentioned your listening tour to us, so we encourage you to identify people you already have reached out to or people you plan to reach out to as part of developing your project. And you can let us know who that is, and we may have other suggestions or reactions to that. And it's also a way of encouraging you to make that list and to reach out to people who can be helpful as part of identifying the project. There's also a space in the prospectus for a diversity statement if you want to include that. And we also ask you to attach your resume. The prospectus, I've included quite a lot of elements there, but we encourage you to be relatively succinct. You can see we say 200 to 750 words, and this is not the full application. It doesn't have to be very beautifully formatted, or in fact, maybe can't be if you're submitting on the website. And is not about kind of giving us a full idea. It's just giving us a sense of what the project is, enough that we can let you know if it's worth putting in the time for a more detailed application that will come. So that's the prospectus stage. The final application, that's October 13th with the prospectus. Final application, December 1st, has some basic summary information, biographical information, a project description, which I'm not going to go into the details of because it's essentially a fleshed out version of the prospectus, but longer, all those same kind of elements. And again, they're on the website. At the prospectus stage, you need not have identified a host necessarily. Many people have, but many haven't, and either way is fine. By the final application stage, you should have identified a host. It's also possible that that's what we might tell you at the prospectus stage. We might have ideas for host organizations if you don't. But at the final application, the host then submits a letter committing to carry out the project, and that's the instructions for what should be in that letter are on the website, which you also attach. Resume again. We have a space on our website for letters of recommendation. We do not view letters of recommendation as a key part of this process, and you should feel no obligation to submit them. But many people are eager to submit them, and because of that, we made a space for them on the website. So I would say not encouraged, unlike some of the other optional things, but available to you if you want them. And there's also ways to indicate that you've submitted a prospectus, so we'll make sure to not lose track of the connections. Then we will select people for interviews on a rolling basis, but most of that will happen, most of the interviews will probably happen in January, and they will be conducted over Zoom, and we will make final decisions in February, by February 15th. And the last thing I'll mention, which was on the timeline, is the renewal. So the renewal, the fellowships are 1 year with the possibility of renewal for a second year. And the renewal application is really an expanded version of the mid-year check-in we do with all fellows roughly halfway through the fellowship term. So there's a few extra questions if you're applying for a renewal, and another letter required from the host organization at that stage. So those are all the stages of the cycle. I'm now going to turn to Maya, who was a 20 to 21 Justice Catalyst Fellow, who has, as she mentioned at the beginning, turned her fellowship project and inspired by her fellowship project into an organization that she started. So she was a fellow at Dream Defenders, working with abolitionist organizers in Miami. And then out of the fellowship with Justice Catalyst support, she launched Beyond the Bars, an amazing base building and community power building organization for people in Miami who are impacted by the carceral system. So we've asked Maya to join to talk a little bit from the applicants and fellows perspective.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jacob and Yesenia. So like Jacob mentioned, I applied for the Justice Catalyst Fellowship in 2019. And then my fellowship started at the beginning of 2020, right before COVID hit. So my fellowship application was, I went through this whole process that you guys are going through now. I, filled out the prospectus. I kind of went, I think we didn't go back and forth too much, but I submitted the prospectus that kind of outlined the work that I wanted to do with Dream Defenders. And it was really a project that centered community lawyering, movement lawyering. That was really kind of like the model of systemic change that I was planning on using. And so the organization that I chose is one that has never had a fellow before. I was the first staff attorney that had ever come on board. So those types of organizations are clearly ones that Justice Catalyst is willing to support. And my work there was really to kind of help launch and support campaign work that Dream Defenders was doing around preventing a jail expansion, working on bail policies, working on issues of pretrial detention in Miami and kind of South Florida and the larger state of Florida as well. And it was really just like a very, I was working within a community organization of organizers on abolitionist projects. And then when COVID hit, things just really, really kind of rapidly changed. And I ended up working with a few other organizations, Advancement Project, Civil Rights Corps, Community Justice Project in Miami, to file federal litigation against a local jail in the local jail system in Miami for the way that people were being, just the total inhumanity with which the jail system was treating people who were incarcerated, and specifically asking for the release of a majority of the jail population. And so, through that process, I was in contact with a huge number of people who were incarcerated, as well as their family members. And, as a result of that litigation, as well as the kind of organizing strategy that this was done in conjunction with, the jail population in Miami was reduced it went from about 4,000 people to 3,000 people in a period of a month. So there was a huge reduction in the jail population. And there was, a lot of media, a lot of stuff, a lot of like activity that was generated as a result of this strategy, kind of the combined litigation with movement work. And so it was, it was a really, really exciting thing. There was a lot of during a time like COVID, when everything is up in the air, having the support of an organization or a fellowship that was, very, very flexible, and recognizing the need to be able to kind of like meet the moment was really helpful. And, like I said, out of that, I was really in contact with a huge number of people who were inside of the jail system, but there was no organization, Dream Defenders is kind of an organization of young people who are abolitionists, very ideologically aligned. And that is not, at all kind of the same population of people who are incarcerated or their family members. So, out of that work, it was very clear to me that, we needed, in order to kind of continue the momentum, continue this type of work, we needed a kind of like container, I guess, to hold those people, to be able to continue to push policy changes related to conditions within the jail, related to decarceral strategies. And so as a result of that, I ended up forming this organization, which I'm currently the executive director of, called Beyond the Bars. And we're doing, a variety of different types of work. One of our big things that we're working on right now is a campaign to make all phone calls out of the jail system free. And, there's a base building strategy to that. There's a community organizing strategy to that. There's also like quite a technical side of that, a legal side around, reviewing contracts and these types of things that we've also been able to work with other organizations around. So yeah, it's been a very exciting couple of years with everything that's happened. But yeah, I would just say I would definitely, highly recommend applying to Justice Catalyst. If anybody wants, has any questions for me, you can feel free to email me, ask me any questions. I'm always happy to be a resource for people who are kind of going through the process. And the last thing that I will mention, I'm not sure if there is anybody on this call who's not currently a law student, might be a few years out. That was actually my situation. And it's very, very hard to find fellowship funding. If I was a public defender for about a year before I applied for the fellowship. And so, it can be, so Justice Catalyst, I think, is one of the only organizations that I found that actually supports people, even if they're not, fresh out of law school. So if there's anybody who's in that situation, again, Justice Catalyst is willing to support those kinds of, you're still very, very early on in your career. You still might have a little bit of experience and might be wanting to shift away into doing more kind of like systemic work. That's a possibility as well.
Thanks so much, Maya. And yes, that's right. So the fellowship is open to anyone who's up to a couple of years out of law school, and it doesn't matter what you've been doing in those 2 years. Maya is just a perfect example of having had a really creative and an important and impactful project, and then also the whole way through through her fellowship year, continuing to adjust and adapt to drastically changing conditions, to the extent of founding a new organization, doing such important and incredible work coming out of it. And so thank you, Maya, for coming in and sharing that experience with us.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to talk through a couple tips that we have kind of come to suggest over a few years of doing this, and then I'm going to turn over to back to Jasenia. So here are some tips. As you're thinking about, and some of these are along the lines of as you're thinking about a strategy or a theory of change for your project. So if your project is focused on impact litigation, you might want to think about what's the timeline for impact litigation. Most impact litigation is longer than a fellowship term, which is fine, but just be aware of that and think about how your fellowship fits into a broader piece of litigation. Think about the resources, which doesn't just mean financial, but all other kinds of resources that are needed to have successful impact litigation, and think about whether those will be in place and how. And then think about what kind of impact litigation makes sense. There's, if you look at the court system, there's some kinds of projects that maybe have a wonderful idea, but may not be that feasible in parts of the federal courts, certainly. So being strategic, not just about what would be a good idea, but what's a feasible idea is very important with an impact litigation project. If your project includes direct representation, the suggestion I would say is that we think direct representation is incredibly important work, and that some broader scale theories of change really need to have a direct representation component, and so many of our projects do. But on the other hand, many of our projects do not have a direct representation component, and it depends on the type of project. If you are going to have a direct representation component, it should be tied to the broader scale strategy. So not just that you're doing some direct representation, and over here you're also doing something else that's aiming at broad scale change. There should be a real connection between the two. If it includes direct representation, think about what that connection is. If your project is focused on research or on advocacy, which it can be, we want to really have you think about what your strategy is to implement that research or for the advocacy to be effective. If it's research, is there a plan that this research will actually get to people and be disseminated to people who it's useful for? We think there are wonderful examples. One I often come back to is the Arch City Defenders Close the Workhouse campaign, which included a big kind of research and policy paper component, but that was very much, and you can kind of read about it on their website, and but that was very much, they did that in coalition with Action St. Louis, among others. But that was very much tied into a broader campaign, and without that, just the paper by itself, as wonderful as it is, would not have been effective. Similarly, if you're focused on advocacy, are the conditions right for success for this kind of advocacy? So again, not just would the thing you're advocating for be a good idea, but is everything in place such that that you have a reason to believe that there's some likelihood, you don't need a guarantee by any means, but some likelihood of making progress or success here. If your theory of change involves coalition or infrastructure building work that I described before, does the coalition exist? And if it doesn't, is it very close to being able to be created? And so, for example, if you want to write model briefings that litigators can use, are there litigators who are prepared or could be prepared to receive those model briefings and use them, or will you be writing into the void? If you have a community education component of your project, again, think about the audience. So is there a community that is already somewhat organized that you'll be working with, or that's latent and you can help to bring together? If you, how will that community be empowered beyond just you providing them information? What's an actual kind of empowerment plan for that community? Are the kind of questions you might think about. So those are all on strategy and theory of change. Another tip is submit a prospectus. There's no downside, even if it's a little bit sloppily written and quickly thrown together. We're fine with that at the prospectus stage. So just submit it and you'll get some feedback. You can even submit more than one. So there's really no downside. Think about scale. I keep coming back to this. We're interested in broad scale change and we want to hear what your theories are that are aiming at that. So, you know, to the extent you can quantify that, include it in your application or prospectus. And then listening tour. When we really care about collaboration and projects that are designed well. And so that requires knowing the needs, knowing the landscape, thinking about who's already doing this work or work adjacent to it, and how you can fill the gaps and work in coalition with them. And so the listening tour is part of both developing your ideas and also beginning to insert yourself into the landscape in which your project will be placed. So those are some assorted tips. And I'm now going to turn back to Jasenia to briefly talk about some of the programming that happens during the fellowship.
Great, thanks. So I'll touch on this all very briefly, and I want to note that all these are optional except for the first one. But these are some of the things that we do to build community and programming in the fellowship. So every quarter there are individual check-ins, and this is done with Jacob. You talk about your fellowship and how that's going on. We do group calls every month. We have aspirations to do a retreat, but given the pandemic, that really hasn't worked out, an in-person retreat too. But we have hopes for spring 2020, but we'll see. We have a reading group that comes and talks about some books. We do other substantive collaboration, and there is opportunity for mentorship between classes. And with that, I will turn it over to John Miller, the Legal Director of Public Rights Project, who will discuss the joint JCPRP Fellowship, which focuses on state, local, and tribal governments.
Thanks, Jasenia. It's so nice to be with everyone. I'm so glad to see so many people on the webinar this evening. Nice to meet you. I'm John Miller, Legal Director of Public Rights Project. I'm based in the Boston area as well. And so I'm just going to talk pretty quickly about the PRP slice of this. Our fellows are part of the overall Justice Catalyst program. But if you apply specifically for placement in this joint fellowship, there are a couple of sort of specific points to note. So Public Rights Project, our mission is to drive the resources and enforcement capacity of state and local governments to protect the rights of those who have been ignored, harmed, and marginalized by government action historically. And so it's about community-based, community-informed, community-connected enforcement, particularly around areas of civil rights, worker rights, environmental justice, consumer protection, housing. So it's a pretty wide area of rights, but it's really about moving the power and authority of government to be rights protecting rather than taking away and harming rights. through the fellowship, we place individuals in government offices to do projects that are focused on this type of rights protection. And so, I'll give you a couple of examples of fellows who are in the program to give you kind of a flavor for what this is. Right now, we have a fellow who just was placed in the San Francisco District Attorney's Office to do worker rights enforcement, and they are building out a practice of using the DA's authority to go after companies that are engaged in wage theft, that are misclassifying their workforce, that are harming workers, right? So it's using the authority, which is both criminal and civil, in the district attorney's office to go after companies that are abusing its workforce. We also have a fellow who this year is placed in the Michigan Secretary of State's office to develop regulations and sort of a mechanism for voting rights protection through the enforcement power of the Secretary of State's office. So, it's an example of a state office that's actually trying to enhance and enforce voting rights as opposed to, cutting them back, as we're seeing in so many other states around the country. And so these projects are really meant to be focused on enforcement. A lot of it is around affirmative litigation, so that could be investigations and or bringing cases in court. We have fellows around the country as part of this program and others. And so there's an opportunity to kind of work closely with other government lawyers around the country around the development of advocacy. It could be specific cases, or it could be sort of a broader, kind of coalition of work. We often work with government partners on amicus briefs or collaborative enforcement, sort of in a number of contexts. And so I think that that's one sort of added piece of these types of placements is you can kind of plug into a network of folks who are working with government, trying to drive the action towards work that is more community connected and community aligned. So I think it's a pretty exciting sort of angle on this program. The fellowship is really impactful. I mean, you heard from Maya directly about sort of that experience, and I think so many fellows really cherish the experience to kind of put together a project, own that project, and sort of see it through. And sometimes the project changes a little bit, right, through circumstances, through kind of challenges, but that kind of evolution is part of like the learning that I think is really essential to being an effective advocate over time. So I think it's a really great program. Hope you'll apply, and would love to hear from some of you about your interest in working in a government partner.
Thanks so much, John. And the timeline and all the details are very similar, and you can find them on our website, on Justice Catalyst's website as well. The same timeline. The prospectus looks a bit different, and it's much more common to apply without a host organization identified in the Joint Fellowship than it is in the Justice Catalyst Fellowship. Jasenia.
Yeah, so we have a section on our website that covers frequently asked questions. So I took a screenshot of it here, but I'll just run through some of the most common ones that we receive. So we are happy to support new organizations, big or small, domestic or international, 501c3s and non-501c3s, whatever organization is the best fit for the project. Though our focus is primarily domestic, and except for the Joint Fellowship, most fellows are 501c3s. And if you ever have any questions that you can't find the answer to on our information sheet or is specific to your project idea, please feel free to email us at fellowships@justicecatalyst.org anytime, and we'll get back to you.
And speaking of questions, the time has now come to answer your questions. So you can see up on the screen various websites and email addresses. The fellowships at justicecatalyst.org is the best way to ask questions. If you want to contact PRP specifically, then you can ask either of us about the Joint Fellowship. But if you want to contact PRP specifically, that's fellows@publicrightsproject.org, and I've also put my email on there. As Jasenia said at the beginning, you can enter questions via the Q&A function is probably the best way to do it. So there's also the chat available, and we will start running through those now. So one of the questions we received is, what kind of projects would be good for work in the union? I think we're open-minded about that. I think it would not be probably just doing standard grievance work in the union. Is probably not the would not be an ideal project for us. But we've had projects that have a kind of impact element, often working to expand scope of enforcement outside of beyond union members in some way. There's been some kind of advocacy campaign component of it, or litigation component of it. You can there's a good example on our website from a past fellow, Unite Local 11, I think it's 11, so that's the kind of project you might think of for a union. But we really would be excited to have more projects unions. We don't get many applications, so encourage you to reach out to us. Let's see. Let's take next. We had a question about the listening tour. Is it okay to describe the types of organizations, roles of the people you've spoken with, but not identify the organizations or people by name? If there's some reason to do that, that's completely fine with us. Definitely don't identify anyone you don't want to be identified. A question about how rolling the rolling deadline is. Is there an advantage to submitting the application early? I would say there's not much advantage. It's rolling, but for the most part, we are reviewing kind of at the deadline. Most applications come in then. Occasionally, we will see an application that comes in early and kind of move on it ahead of the receiving all applications, but there isn't I would say, a significant advantage to applying early, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your project will be reviewed in advance. A question about what type of percentage of projects get renewed for a second year. So I'm not able to give an exact number, but I think the majority of projects who apply for renewal for a second year get some kind of additional funding. And I say some kind of additional funding because in many cases it's partial and the host organization matches, and we're not funding the whole second year, or maybe the funding is not for a whole second year, but for an additional 6 months to kind of finish something that needs to be finished, but it won't take a whole other year. But most projects get some kind of renewal, and we really encourage you to work with your host organization to see if there are resources to contribute towards the project in the second year. A question about waiting to submit your full application until we receive a response about your prospectus. I would suggest that you do, though. If your application is ready, you can submit it. There's not much downside, but might as well hold off until you hear back from us. There's a question about, should applicants be no more than 2 years out of law school at the time of the application deadline or at the time the fellowship begins? We mean the time the fellowship begins generally, or like that could be, around then. So if you're applying for a fellowship that starts in 2022, that's for 2020 graduates or 21 or 22 graduates. But we occasionally make exceptions to that, including we've had a couple of fellows who are not lawyers for various reasons. Including one fellowship project, which is focusing on the exclusion of formerly incarcerated people from law schools in some cases. So that's there's different types of flexibility, but generally that's what we mean by 2 years. We've got another question about funding for a second year, which I think I covered. Talk more about the scope aspect. I mentioned it should be broad, but can that include projects focused on the significant issue in a single state? And the answer to that is yes, it can be. Definitely can be on an issue within one state and on one issue. So broad is in the the scale of people being affected, and for different types of projects that could be very different. There may be a project where you're focusing on millions and a project where you're focusing on hundreds, and those are both can be broad scale in different ways. So I'm sorry that that's relatively vague, but mostly we just want you thinking about scale as you apply. Perspective statements is a little bit of we kind of tend to get a few in and then review kind of a pile at once and then get to the next pile. It can, depending on when that is, it can be several weeks before we get back to you. If you happen to submit just before we kind of start that process, it might be a much quicker turnaround. The vast majority of our prospectuses we're going to now get in the next couple of weeks. Historically, that's what's happened anyway. So there is probably a bit of a longer turnaround if you submit in early October, just because we're going to have many more to review. How many fellows we take each year is not exactly fixed, but partly because there's some interaction with renewals and other things. But we've had roughly 20 in the past few years, so that's the ballpark. A question about Justice Catalyst and PRP's perspectives on repeat host organizations where fellows currently are or have recently been placed. Are they favored or disfavored? I'll answer for Justice Catalyst and then ask John to speak to PRP. For Justice Catalyst, I would say they are not. They are neither favored nor disfavored. I would say a bit more on each side. On the disfavored side, we're actually open to having multiple applications from the same host organization in the same year, and we try to treat each application separately. So it's not a disadvantage that someone has been in an organization before, nor is it an advantage. I would say, with the slight exception that, if there's an organization that's doing great work that kind of aligns with the values of this that I've been laying out, that we've all been laying out, it's maybe slightly more, that's kind of a sign maybe that it's the right kind of organization. I wouldn't say that there's zero correlation from year to year, but for the most part, we're not paying attention to that as a factor in any way. John, do you want to answer for PRP's perspective?
Sure. I think sort of a similar answer. It doesn't. I don't think it like disqualifies you. I would say, in my experience, I hear from a lot of people who are really excited to work in the New York Attorney General's office. That's a, just sort of like a office that people are like really interested in. And I say, what about the Flint, Michigan City Attorney's office, right? Like I think thinking a little bit about untraditional places where there's opportunity to catalyze sort of new work that is going to get projects a little bit more attention. So I think it's certainly possible, and we have done repeat placements with Justice Catalyst or through our fellowship program overall. But I think thinking creatively about where you might have a connection to do work that is new and different is like the most compelling. It's like, you got to tell us a story about why you to do this project in this place. And if you can say that in a really compelling way, that's going to make your project, I think, particularly impactful and meaningful to us.
We have a question about, can applicants who are not US citizens and LLM students apply? The answer is yes, though we're not really in a position to help with any visa issues or immigration advice. So unfortunately, that will fall to you and your host organization to figure that out. The way this is different for the PRP fellowship, but for the joint fellowship, but for the Justice Catalyst fellowship, the host organization will be the employer of the fellow. The grant funding goes to the host organization, who then employs the fellow. And so it's really between you and your fellow and the host organization to work out if it's possible for you to stay and work it from a visa perspective. But assuming that, then yes, it's open to LLM students and non-US citizens. And a question about how long does a successful applicant have to accept, reject an offer of a fellowship once notified? There's some flexibility on this. I'll answer for the, I don't want to answer for the joint fellowship, but for the JC fellowship, we normally ask if you can get back to us in a week or so, but if you have some reason that you can't then you can just kind of stay in touch with us usually, and we'll usually be able to make an exception. But that's our normal kind of initial request, but not demand, I'd say. I think that has. Oh, here's another question coming in. More about the diversity statement. So that you're welcome to include whatever you want, but I would say most diversity statements. The question says, can you speak more about the diversity statement? Is it about why you as a fellow are diverse in general, or why or how your diversity informs your project? I appreciate the quotation marks there. I'd say for the diversity statement, it's more the former. We're not really focused on the project in that piece of the application. You're welcome to make explicit connections, and that might go in the project description if you're talking about how how it informs the project specifically. So more focused on you as an individual in the diversity statement, but you're welcome to draw those connections anywhere. Any other questions? I'm not seeing anything else in the chat or the Q&A.
We received a question earlier about someone asking if you could describe a little bit more what sustainability looks like for a project.
Oh, yes. So apparently my mic may have cut out for a second then. Apologies if that's the case. So sustainability can mean a few different things. It can mean that the project itself has the potential to be continued beyond the fellowship term. So maybe your host organization will be able to continue it in some way. It could mean that it is something that could be picked up by other organizations. We count that as a kind of sustainability. Or it could even be a funding type of sustainability. So if your project is doing a type of litigation that has fee shifting, or that a organization may be able to use to apply for grant funding to continue, those are kind of questions we're interested in as well. Anything that indicates you're thinking in the long term and not just what's going to happen in that fellowship term is the kind of thing we have in mind for sustainability. That is on the hour. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and a huge thank you to my fellow panelists, Jasenia and John and Maya, for joining. And we will, you have on the screen there email addresses to contact us, and we really look forward to seeing prospectuses.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.